"Get your butt out of my seat, boy." The words dropped into the first-class cabin like a blade, sharp and ice-cold, silencing the premium rows in less than a heartbeat. It was not a polite reminder, not a gentle question. It was a command shaped by invisible power, the power of practiced judgment of entitlement, so familiar with being served that it no longer recognized itself. Ethan Brooks froze in the narrow aisle. Boarding pass for seat 2. A still in his hand, the warm gold cabin lights casting a soft halo over his face, making his eyes look darker, deeper, as if concealing something. A calm man, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed simply in a grey hoodie and clean black jeans. Nothing about him demanded attention, and that was exactly why they were wrong. Linda Hartley, the woman who had thrown out that sentence, sat as if the seat had been born for her. Her immaculate white suit showed no crease. A cold diamond bracelet on her wrist caught the cabin light. Her perfectly made-up face and assessing gaze traveled down Ethan as though she was looking at an intruder. She crossed her legs, claimed both armrests, leaned smugly toward the window, behaving as if everything in first class belonged to her, including the man standing before her. The entire cabin held its breath. Some passengers pretended to lower their faces into magazines, while their eyes peeked over the top edge. Others lifted their phones ever so slightly, their dark screens reflecting the curiosity they tried to hide, craving the drama, but terrified of being seen watching it. No one spoke. No one wanted trouble. No one wanted to clash with a woman who looked like she knew a few politicians or had donated to $1,000 charities. But Ethan heard the quickening beat of his own heart, not from fear, not from anger, but from memory, the memories he had predicted, grown familiar with, and faced thousands of times on his climb to the top. He knew what it felt like to be misjudged at first glance. It was so familiar he could predict every look, every dismissive shrug, every invalidating sentence. But this time he did not bow. "This is seat 2. Ethan said softly, almost gently, as if not wanting to crack the tension in the air, yet his voice carried strength, low, clear, unwavering. He held the boarding pass toward Linda. She glanced at him, lips curling in a half-smile, half disdain, half triumph, the kind of person who could create 3 halves without needing math. "You people always think you can sit wherever you want," she announced, loudly enough for 2 rows to hear. Someone in seat 1D turned to the window, avoiding their own guilt. Someone in the row behind widened their eyes, but stayed silent. In first class, silence usually cost its weight in gold. Today it was worth nothing more than cowardice. A sharp click of heels echoed against the aircraft floor. Melissa Grant, a young flight attendant, approached with the strained smile of someone who had worked service too long. Her ponytail was tight, her navy uniform fitted her steps quick but graceful. "Sir Economy is behind you," she said, before Ethan could respond. Maybe she believed she was diffusing a problem before it erupted. Maybe she thought she had identified the troublemaker. But she had not looked. Not at the ticket. Not at the details. Not at the truth. "This is my seat," Ethan repeated, raising the boarding pass closer to her face. Melissa did not glance at it. "Please move now." The request carried the tone of authority, but not real authority, just the habitual confidence of someone who believed she was always right. In row 3, a teenage girl placed her phone against the sunshade and began live-streaming the words, "When a black man gets kicked out of his own seat, wait for it appearing on screen." In less than 20 seconds more than 600 viewers joined. Linda smirked, leaning fully back as if she were a queen watching a cheap comedy unfold. Ethan fixed his gaze on Melissa, and in his eyes there was something that made her hesitate for a split second, a calmness that made no sense. It was not the calm of someone used to rejection. It was the calm of someone used to power, the calm of a man who understood decision-making at levels she had never experienced. A passenger in row 2 slipped one headphone off his ear, pretending not to listen, but hearing everything. Another raised their phone a little higher, capturing Linda's arrogant expression. Ethan inhaled slowly, not from exhaustion, but from calculation. His silence was not weakness. It was a choice one that unsettled everyone watching. They were waiting for him to snap, waiting for him to lose control so they could confirm the prejudice already forming in their minds. But he did not. He spoke a single line, soft enough to sound calm, strong enough to land with weight. "Check the manifest." Melissa crossed her arms, exhaling sharply as if losing patience. "So stop making this difficult." But something strange flickered through the cabin. A momentary pause in Melissa's movement. A quick glance at Ethan's phone, its screen still on, and a brief flicker of unease in Linda's eyes. Because deep inside Ethan's calm stare was something that didn't match their assumptions. Something unlike the people they had dismissed in the past. Something unlike the passengers they had forced to the back. Something unlike the insults they had just thrown at him. Something that made them swallow once, involuntarily. A faint instinct whispering that they had misjudged him badly. Ethan remained standing, boarding pass in hand, spine, straight gaze, steady, as if the entire cabin were waiting for his final word. And in that suspended moment, no one yet knew that seat 2A was not just a first-class seat. It was the heart of an empire. And the man standing before them was not a troublemaker. He was the one who held the key to everything they served. But they did not know that. Not yet. The moment Ethan stood motionless in the narrow aisle, stretched thin like a tightly pulled wire, waiting for the smallest spark to snap. Melissa clenched her jaw as if trying to hold on to the authority her uniform granted her. Yet her eyes flickered a tiny shift that only a keen observer would notice, and perhaps only Ethan did. Linda exhaled sharply, smoothing the sleeve of her white blazer with a gesture full of pride, as if adjusting her posture for a photo shoot. "Are you deaf?" she sneered. "He told you to move." Ethan did not answer. He did not need to. His silence was heavier than any protest, a mirror reflecting back on everyone watching, even those silently convincing themselves they were not part of this moment. In row 3, Emily Turner tilted her camera to capture a wider frame. Viewers passed 2,000. Comments rushed by like floodwater. "Why won't they check his ticket? This is racism and no one's stopping it. Who is this guy? He's way too calm. Out there in real life, outrage stayed silent. But online, it had begun to scream." Ethan glanced around the cabin. He saw everything: the man pretending to sleep, whose eyelids trembled slightly, the elderly woman burying her face into her handbag, as if not seeing the situation meant she bore no responsibility, the young couple in row 4 so tense that the wife's fingers dug into her husband's arm without her noticing. Every person carried a different fear: fear of being dragged into trouble, fear of being judged, fear of standing up only to be mocked online. But the greatest fear of all was the fear of realizing they had been wrong. Melissa stepped forward half a pace, with forced confidence, trying to assert dominance in front of the entire cabin. "So last warning." And then something in her voice startled even her. A faint tremble, a brief disconnect. Who was she talking to exactly? A concise, silent, polite passenger, or someone she did not understand? Because every time Ethan looked at her, his eyes carried a stillness she had never felt from any passenger. Not resignation, not defiance, but certainty. A certainty that felt like he already knew the situation was about to flip, even if no one else believed it. Linda tilted her head with mocking disdain. "This is taking forever. Can we just go kick him out already?" A small laugh slipped from somewhere in the cabin, the laugh of someone who believed they were safely detached from the conflict. But when that laugh echoed, Ethan gently turned his wrist to check his watch, a simple gesture. One long second stretched the air tight. Melissa faltered. A normal man would not remain this calm while being publicly humiliated. A powerless man would not hold such a steady gaze. No, something did not align, but Linda mistook it for helplessness. "Look at him," she said loudly. "He knows he doesn't belong here." Those words rolled over Ethan like an old, tired rain, one he had weathered his whole life. Yet this time, it did not weigh him down. It simply clarified. He had always known this moment would come. Then something remarkable happened, subtle enough to miss, but enough to shift the rhythm of the story. A passenger, the man in seat 3B, paused mid-keystroke on his laptop. He froze, not out of curiosity, but because something in Ethan's eyes made him look up. In half a second, the man realized the argument might not be as simple as it seemed. Maybe they had just crossed the wrong person, but he immediately lowered his head again, afraid Linda's gaze might land on him. A tiny decision, yet a cowardly one. Ethan looked at Melissa again, his voice deep and steady, not rising by even a note, yet chilling enough to raise goosebumps. "Check. The manifest." Each word fell like a knock on a door she did not want to open, because she knew that if she checked, the truth would surface, and the truth might not be on her side. Linda scoffed. "Why bother? We already know where you belong." Belong, a simple word, but loaded with centuries of weight, stacked with layers of prejudice carried across generations. Ethan still did not reply. He drew one slow breath. In that moment, no one knew what thought surged through his mind, but the all-seeing narration could see it all: childhood memories of being questioned in stores for no reason, moments when he was mistaken for staff, even in suit business meetings where people only looked at him after he handed out his card, moments when his heart tightened, not from pain, but from the endurance he had forged. He had climbed to the top. He held power in his hands. And yet here, in the first-class cabin of his own airline, they still did not see him, and that was their greatest mistake. The cabin simmered like a small pot sealed too tightly. Some passengers exchanged worried glances, some sucked in a breath out of embarrassment, some discreetly adjusted their cameras to capture Ethan's reaction. The live stream soared past 7,000 views, then 9,000, then 12,000. And amid the chaotic stream of comments, one message rose to the top: "He's too calm. Watch, he's someone important." Melissa swallowed hard. A small bead of sweat formed on her temple, not from heat, but from doubt, the doubt she should have felt earlier. Why was he not afraid? Why was he not arguing? Why was he not shouting? Only one type of person stayed silent like this. A person with power. Linda sighed with impatience. Enough. Just get security and get rid of him. But before Melissa could lift her radio, Ethan did something simple. He reached into the pocket of his hoodie. The movement was slow and controlled. No one knew what he was about to take out. A nearby man recoiled slightly. Melissa tensed on instinct. Linda squinted, ready to mock him. Emily moved her camera closer. Ethan pulled out his phone. The screen lit up in his palm. And for the first time in the entire 10-minute chaos, the entire first-class cabin fell completely silent. Because on that screen, even from a glance, was a logo every Orion Air employee knew. A logo Melissa had seen thousands of times during training. A logo Linda saw whenever she opened the premium customer app. A logo no one expected to appear in the hand of the man they had just insulted. The logo of Executive Access, an application only a few dozen people in the company were permitted to use, and only one person held the highest clearance. Ethan slid his finger across the screen slowly, as if all time belonged to him. The screen switched to a sleek black interface, displaying options: Internal Systems Crew Management Operations Board, Executive Profile. Melissa's mouth fell open. Linda straightened abruptly. Emily's breath trembled as she struggled to keep her camera steady. Ethan tapped the last option, Executive Profile. The screen displayed, "Welcome Ethan Brooks, Chief Executive Officer, Orion Air." But he did not turn the phone around. Not yet. He simply let the glow of the screen reflect across his face, just enough for those watching to feel it. The cold realization that they had just made a mistake no apology could ever fix. Silence. A special kind of silence, not the kind born from having nothing to say, but the kind that happens when everything people believed a moment ago is shattered in one instant. The glow from the phone in Ethan's hand cast a cold halo across his face. Beautiful, mysterious, commanding, as if he was not standing there asking for the right to sit, but reclaiming something that already belonged to him. Melissa froze. Blood rushed to her face until her ears burned red, yet her palms turned ice cold. She did not understand what was happening, but her instincts told her she was no longer facing a passenger. She was facing a system she worked under, a system she may have just offended. Linda's fingers tightened around her purse strap, her red nails trembling. She tried to maintain the superiority she had worn like a second skin for years, the reflex of someone accustomed to being greeted with bowed heads, to being prioritized, to being indulged. But as the light reflected on Ethan's screen touched her face, she felt for the first time in years like she was the one beneath someone else. Emily Turner nearly stopped breathing. The livestream jumped from 14,000 to 22,000 viewers in less than 30 seconds. Comments surged like a flood. "That's the CEO app. No way, no freaking way." Turn the phone, show his screen, but Emily did not need to move her camera. The man at the center of it all would reveal it himself. Ethan Brooks, silent from the beginning, finally turned the screen slightly toward Melissa. A small gesture, a simple movement through the air. Yet the impact felt like a monolith crashing into a still lake, sending waves through every soul in the cabin. Chief Executive Officer, Orion Air. Melissa covered her mouth and stumbled back half a step. Linda's jaw fell open, her breath breaking into shallow gasps. A man in the back nearly dropped his laptop, and in that instant, the all-seeing narration witnessed every thought crashing through each mind. In Melissa, pure panic, not only because she was wrong, but because she had not bothered to verify. She had assumed he was in the wrong. She had assumed he did not belong in seat 2A. And now that assumption had betrayed her. In Linda, a shattering fear not of Ethan himself, but of consequences, social fallout, reputation, damage the image she had built over the years. Fear of this moment spreading like fire across the very social networks she pretended to use only for news, though everyone knew she used them to flaunt her life. In the other passengers, a strange mixture of emotions, shame for staying silent, relief that the truth did not land on them, and a guilty thrill at witnessing a rare reversal. And in Ethan, a serene stillness, the stillness of someone who knew truth had finally spoken for itself. He did not need to shout. He did not need to argue. He did not need to defend. Truth was doing that for him. "Sir." Melissa stammered, her throat so dry that every syllable scraped like sand. I didn't realize." Ethan locked his screen. The soft click sounded louder than any announcement on the plane. "You didn't want to realize." He did not raise his voice, but half the cabin heard him more clearly than any airline safety briefing. Melissa bowed her head. Linda gripped the armrest as if it were the last thing anchoring her to the world, but the cabin had no time to recover before another sound sliced through the tension. Thunk, thunk, thunk. The heavy steps of the security team rushing in from the jet bridge. They arrived like a fast-moving storm. 2 officers stepped into the cabin. Officer Jamal Green, tall, broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, yet calm, and Detective Rachel Nguyen, smaller in stature, but carrying a gaze as sharp as a thin blade. Both paused at the front of the cabin, immediately sensing the weight of what awaited them. "What's the issue?" Rachel asked, her voice steady, without the usual urgency of someone used to in-flight conflicts. Melissa swallowed hard. He refused to move to his assigned seat. Rachel tilted her head. No expression, no judgment, only observation. "Did you verify his boarding pass?" Silence. Complete silence, the kind that felt like someone had muted the entire cabin. Ethan extended his boarding pass. Rachel took it, looked once, and immediately confirmed Seat 2A. Confirmed. A confirmation as soft as wind, yet sharp enough to slice through every strand of intentional and unintentional deception that had bound him since the first moment. Jamal locked eyes with Melissa, then with Linda. "So neither of you checked his pass?" The question was not meant for an answer. It was a verdict. Melissa's lips lost all color. Linda breathed heavily like someone who had run a marathon. Rachel turned her gaze to Ethan's phone. "Is that executive access?" Ethan nodded, once slow and sharp. Rachel looked toward Jamal. "We need to document this." The entire cabin heard it. Some passengers sat straighter, as if bracing for a judge's sentence. Some pulled up their masks to hide their faces, even though they did not need to. Linda's hand trembled at her collar. Melissa felt her knees weaken. Jamal began taking notes. Rachel photographed the boarding pass and the phone interface. A witness in the back raised their camera higher, as if all present were bowing before the moment truth revealed itself. Then Ethan sat down slowly and gently, as if finally allowing himself to take the seat that had always been his. But before leaning back, he looked directly at Melissa and said, with the voice of someone who had fought too many battles to still feel hurt by being underestimated, "You treated me like I didn't belong, but this airline belongs to me." Linda collapsed into her seat, nearly breathless. Melissa blinked rapidly, trying to keep tears from falling. Rachel continued writing. Jamal reached for his radio. Emily brought her phone closer to the scene. The live stream jumped to 40,000, then 50,000, then 70,000. But the story was not over. In truth, it had only just begun. News travelled faster than the breaths inside first class. As Rachel and Jamal began documenting the incident, beams of light from dozens of phones lit up the cabin at the same time, like a small sky filled with living stars. These stars were not shining to be beautiful. They were shining to witness. A passenger in row 2, the one who had been pretending to sleep, now trembled as he switched on his camera, because he understood this moment would travel far beyond the motionless aircraft, far beyond the people shrinking into their seats, far beyond the careless words they had chosen to speak or chosen to swallow. Linda Hartley sank into her seat, her white suit suddenly feeling as heavy as stone. Memories spun in her mind, fundraisers' sweet compliments, the photos she posted online with proud captions about success and class. But now they felt like hollow balloons. She felt them popping one by one inside her chest. Never had she felt so small, small enough to disappear into the cloud of data streaming across tens of thousands of screens in real time. As for Melissa Grant, she did not dare raise her head. She did not dare meet a single pair of eyes. Every glance in the cabin felt like a mirror reflecting what she had refused to see, that she had chosen bias instead of protocol, impulse instead of procedure. And now the price was arriving faster than the faint tremble of the aircraft. Yet the calmest person remained Ethan. He sat still, hands interlocked, eyes fixed forward, not triumphant, not angry, simply steady. There was a beauty in that steadiness, the beauty of someone who had long grown used to battles he never started, but was forced to finish. He felt everything around him, tension, confusion, fear, regret, shame swirling through the air like a flock of disoriented birds. And in all that chaos, he was the only one unmoved. Mr. Brooks, Rachel said, her voice steady on the surface, yet carrying a growing respect in every syllable. We need a statement from you. Ethan nodded slightly. Of course. His slow, clear tone softened the suffocating atmosphere, yet it stiffened Melissa's spine even more because it sounded like the tone of a man used to boardrooms, used to making decisions, used to being heard. Not someone she had any right to command. Rachel wrote notes occasionally, glancing at Emily's live-streaming phone. She already knew this case would not end at an internal report. It would escalate. It would explode. And people would ask why a chief executive officer had needed to prove he had the right to sit in a seat his own company had placed his name on. At the back of the first-class cabin, a young man watched the live stream on his phone while keeping his eyes on Ethan. He wondered how someone could remain so composed while the entire world was watching him be humiliated. But he did not know that Ethan had endured far greater battles. Battles no camera recorded, battles no public cared about, battles he had stood through alone. Jamal, usually the quiet one, finally spoke. We're classifying this as a potential discrimination incident. Each word fell like a hammer, not because of their meaning, but because Linda and Melissa both knew this label could not be swept under a rug, could not be blurred, could not be softened by a stack of apology forms. It was a stain on a career, sometimes on a life that could not be washed away. Emily's live stream passed 80,000 viewers. Comments erupted. He's the CEO, Melissa is done. Linda is about to cry for real. Ethan did not look at the live stream. He did not need to. He was sitting in the eye of the storm, and he knew exactly how storms moved. So Rachel continued, "Do you wish to press charges?" The question hung in the air. Everyone held their breath. Linda gripped her armrest so tightly the veins in her hand stood out. Melissa nearly whispered, "Please don't," without daring to open her mouth. Ethan closed his eyes for 1 second. Just one. A single second long enough for the third-person narration to glimpse his thoughts. He had not come here for revenge, not to destroy the careers of those who did not understand him, not to become an online hero. He had come to see the truth, and he had seen it. When he opened his eyes, his voice was soft as wind, yet its strength lay in what he didn't say or than what he did say. "I'm not here for punishment." Linda exhaled like someone spared from execution. Melissa nearly collapsed. Ethan continued, "I'm here for accountability." That word accountability rang in everyone's mind like a bell. It did not kill anyone, but it forced everyone to live honestly. Rachel nodded. She understood. A man like Ethan had no need for revenge. People like Linda and Melissa had already created their own verdicts. Jamal wrote a few more lines. Some passengers exhaled in relief. Some bowed their heads in shame. But no one spoke. No one dared break the sacred tension of the moment, as Ethan rose, slightly turned toward the cabin, then finally rested his back against seat 2A. For the first time since he stepped onto the plane, the entire cabin felt it. This was exactly where he belonged. And that realization made them feel both admiration and smallness. But that moment was only temporary calm. Because the instant Ethan set his phone on the tray table, thousands of comments kept pouring into the live stream. News outlets began sharing the clip. Major accounts started attaching hashtags, and far away in the headquarters of Orion Air, the public relations team was preparing for the biggest media firestorm of the year. And no one in first class realized that Ethan had not yet started his true response. They had only seen him stand. They had not seen him act. The quiet inside first class did not last long. It was the kind of silence that comes before thunder, thick, heavy trembling. The soft white cabin lights reflected off skin, off metal frames, off the widened eyes of those who had just witnessed the most brutal shift in power they had ever seen. Everyone understood one thing: the truth was out, but the consequences had not yet begun. Ethan Brooks sat upright, his hands resting lightly on his knees. Not a single muscle tense, not a single breath uneven. He looked less like a man who had just been challenged over a seat, and more like a man sitting in his executive office. But what made the cabin choke on its own air was not his calm. It was the realization that if he wanted to, the careers of half the cabin could collapse with a few taps on his screen. Linda Hartley felt her heart slam wildly in her chest, not out of concern for Ethan, but for herself. She thought about her company, about her proud managerial title, about the inevitable HR email, the crisis call from corporate communications, the hundreds of comments demanding her termination. All because of one sentence she had tossed out for years like breathing "you don't belong here." But the cameras were recording, and the internet does not forget. Melissa Grant was different. Her mind was not filled with reputation or social fallout. Her mind was filled with fear, losing her job bills, student loans, aging parents. Everything lined up in a long chain that tightened her throat. She had studied the procedures, memorized conflict resolution protocols. She knew the first step was always to check the boarding pass. But today, she had skipped it. Not because she was in a hurry, because she believed in something else more than she believed in the truth. Something she would never dare speak aloud, but something that had guided her in the most critical moment of her career. Meanwhile, 16-year-old Emily Turner trembled with excitement. Her live stream passed 120,000 viewers. The numbers jumped so fast her eyes widened like she was witnessing a supernatural event. But beneath her excitement, something deeper stirred something she did not fully understand. She was not filming because she wanted drama. She was filming because she felt justice rising right before her eyes, and she knew not every teenager gets to stand in the center of a moment that could change something bigger than themselves. Rachel Nguyen, sharp-minded and observant, lowered her pen. "Mr. Brooks, is there anything else you'd like to add before I finalize the report?" Ethan turned his head slightly, his eyes catching the cabin light. "Yes," he said, his voice deep, resonant, calm. "Tell the captain I'd like to speak to him." Melissa's heart lurched. Linda's jaw fell open, unable to form words. Several passengers exchanged looks, as though they had just heard a summons from a powerful figure in a political drama. Jamal called the flight crew over the radio. Only 20 seconds later, the lead flight attendant, Jacob Reynolds, appeared, a man in his 40s with the weathered face and confident posture of someone used to command. But when he saw what was unfolding, the camera's security, Melissa's pale face, his expression changed. Tension flickered through his eyes, mixed with a hint of fear. "Mr. Brooks asked for the captain," Jamal said. Jacob glanced at Ethan, and in that moment, the third-person narration could see every muscle in Jacob's face tighten then release, as if two pieces of information finally snapped into place. Ethan Brooks, Executive Access, Chief Executive Officer, the pieces connected. Jacob hurried toward the cockpit door. 1 minute later, Captain Howard Pierce, a seasoned pilot with more than 25 years of international experience, stepped out. He was calm, composed, but the moment he saw the electric tension gripping the cabin, he stopped mid-step. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "they said you needed to speak with me." Ethan did not stand. He did not need to. A single look from him made Captain Pierce adjust his posture, unconsciously, standing straighter like someone entering an important briefing room. "I want to know," Ethan said slowly, "why your crew decided not to verify my boarding pass before asking security to remove me." The question hit the cabin like a lightning strike on metal. Pierce looked at Melissa. She bowed her head. He looked at Linda. Her knuckles whitened on the armrest. Then he looked back at Ethan and realized he was not speaking to a passenger. He was speaking to the man who could change the fate of his crew and possibly the fate of the airline itself. "Mr. Brooks," Pierce began, his voice far less confident than before. "I was informed there was a dispute." A dispute Ethan cut in his voice, low but sharp, cold enough to drop the temperature of the entire aircraft. Or, an assumption, several passengers held their breath. The question was not only directed at Captain Pierce, it was aimed at everyone who had chosen silence. Pierce sighed, his shoulders sagging. "Sir, I apologize. This shouldn't have happened." Ethan stared at him, offering no nod, no forgiveness, no easy comfort. Because an apology was not enough, and everyone in the cabin felt it. Then he unlocked his phone again. Emily nearly screamed in excitement. Viewers surged past 180,000. Ethan opened a restricted internal menu. The screen displayed categories: crew compliance incident protocol, legal notifications, internal audit, executive authority overrides. He tapped the last option. Jacob's breath caught. Melissa trembled hard. Linda's hand flew to her mouth. Ethan did not raise his voice, but his words had the power to shift the axis of someone's world. I'm initiating an internal review of crew conduct for Flight 932. The entire cabin recoiled, as if struck by a cold wind. Pierce opened his mouth, perhaps to ask for leniency, to explain, to soften the blow. But Ethan lifted a hand, slightly stopping him in silence, not because he wanted to humiliate anyone, but because sometimes silence was the most fitting consequence. In that moment, every mask fell away, the confidence, the arrogance, the indifference, the false innocence. Only vulnerable, unshielded human beings remained forced to confront the truth of themselves. Yet the most frightening part was not that Ethan had begun an investigation. The most frightening part for everyone who had been wrong was realizing that until now, Ethan had used only a small fraction of his power, and no one knew what he would do next. The conversation seemed to freeze the instant Ethan announced an internal investigation. From the moment he pressed initiate review, the atmosphere inside first class shifted completely. The earlier chaos vanished. The scattered whispers died out. What remained was a silence, heavy, as lead, the kind of silence in which people could hear their own heartbeat striking against their ribs. Captain Pierce stood stiff hands, locked behind his back, like a military cadet awaiting judgment. Jacob Reynolds tried to keep his face neutral, but his eyes stayed locked on Ethan's phone, as if it were a blade pressed against the final thread of his career. And Melissa, she could barely breathe. Her fingers were clenched so tightly, the knuckles turned white, a coldness spreading down her spine despite the steady cabin air. Linda Hartley sat motionless, yet inside her thoughts, scattered like a hive of bees pushed from their nest. Every time she looked at Ethan, she no longer saw a man in a grey hoodie. She saw a gigantic mirror reflecting the exact smallness and shallowness she had spent years refusing to confront. She felt with painful clarity the truth many people never admit: she had lived too long, wrapped in blind confidence, believing that money, status, and skin tone could shield her from consequences. But today that armor had been ripped away without mercy. Ethan remained calm, sitting with the composure of someone in the top-floor office of Orion Air headquarters. His voice was low, steady, and cold enough to make the cabin shiver. "I want the captain's report added to the file." Captain Pierce swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." That single "sir," spoken aloud in the middle of first class, fell like a metal bar hitting the floor. Everyone heard it echo in their minds. One by one, every passenger realized the truth was no longer a secret shared by a few. It was official. He was the chief executive officer. He outranked the entire crew. He held the authority to fire, suspend, investigate, or restructure entire departments. And he was doing it right in front of them with absolute calm. "Mr. Brooks," Rachel said softly, her tone far gentler than when she had first entered, "would you like us to escort any of the involved parties for further questioning?" The question felt like a blade sliding between ribs. Melissa swayed. Jacob's hands tightened. Linda's heart dropped to her stomach. Ethan shook his head. "Not yet." Those two words dropped the temperature of the cabin another degree. Not forgiveness, not leniency, only not yet. Ethan unlocked his phone again. The screen glowed bright in his hand, the center of this small universe. He selected another menu, legal and policy. A list appeared: external counsel, PR coordination, compliance violations, internal ethics committee. Each one of these options held the power to send someone's career into free fall in less than a minute. And Ethan chose the one no one expected: PR coordination. Melissa's head jerked up, her lips trembling. Linda's breath caught in her throat. "Mr. Brooks." Jacob spoke, voice hoarse. "Please don't escalate this publicly. We can resolve this internally." Ethan looked at him. His eyes were not angry, not gentle, just cold as winter water. Internally he repeated, as if weighing the word. Then he spoke quiet but sharp as a newly honed blade. "The world is already watching. There is no internal anymore." Emily exhaled sharply, the sound caught perfectly by her phone's microphone. The live stream surged past 220,000 viewers. Comments boomed like thunder. "He's not playing. That crew is done. This is history." Ethan continued, voice slow and deliberate. "But I will not let humiliation be the headline. I want the truth to be the headline." Something in his tone made everyone feel it. He was not seeking revenge. He was seeking change. His words were soft, but carried the weight of someone not only lifting himself above an insult, but trying to lift an entire system out of the decay that had corroded it. Melissa nearly burst into tears, not from fear of punishment, but from understanding the difference between fake power and real power. Fake power makes people loud. Real power makes people quiet. Captain Pierce spoke, trying to keep his breathing steady. "Mr. Brooks, I take full responsibility. I should have verified before authorizing anything." Ethan looked at him. Responsibility is not about apologizing. It is about correcting. The word correcting hit the cabin like a hammer. "Sir, what do you want us to do?" Rachel asked. Ethan leaned back into his seat, and in that moment it did not look like someone relaxing. It looked like someone who had made a decision. "We're going to finish this flight." 4 simple words stunned the cabin. Linda did not understand. Melissa could not believe it. Jacob's eyes widened. "Captain Pierce almost asked, sir. You still want to fly with this crew?" Ethan exhaled softly, a breath that made the entire cabin bow inward. "Leaving would fix nothing. Staying makes everything undeniable." There was something profound in that sentence, something beautiful and fierce, something no one in the cabin had ever witnessed in real life. Ethan did not punish by walking away. He punished by staying. Then he pressed the lock button on his screen. The soft click felt like a curtain falling. "Now," Ethan said calmly, a calm so sharp it raised goosebumps. "Let's see who learns from this moment." No one moved. No one spoke. No one breathed too loudly. Only the hum of the engines waiting for takeoff and the chaotic rhythm of the hearts inside the cabin, beating with the realization that this was no longer an incident. This was a lesson. And Ethan was the teacher they never wanted, but today were forced to listen to. The aircraft trembled softly as the engines powered up, signaling that takeoff was moments away. But even that tremor was gentler than the shaking inside those who had just lived through the greatest shock of their lives. No one spoke. No one dared look another person in the eye. They were all sitting inside the same 70-meter steel vessel, heading toward the same city. Yet they were no longer in the same world they had been in when they boarded. Melissa stood near the first-class doorway, her back, straight hands clasped in front of her like a student awaiting punishment. Every movement she made felt stiff and unnatural, as though even Ethan's breaths could become her sentence. Jacob stood just behind her, attempting to maintain composure, but unable to hide the way his fingers clenched the seat edge. And Linda? She sat frozen in seat 2A, like a breathing statue. Every time Ethan turned his head even slightly to the left, she recoiled as if one glance from him might make her collapse entirely. Emily Turner, still live-streaming, no longer trembled from excitement. The narration, could see the change in her eyes. Her thrill had shifted into a sense of responsibility. The 16-year-old girl understood that what she was recording was no longer just drama, it was becoming historical evidence. The viewer count climbed past 260,000, then 300,000. The comments were no longer mere reactions. They were the outcry of people who had been mistreated, dismissed, doubted for reasons they could never fully defend against. They were watching Ethan, the way people look at someone who finally stands up in a space where they themselves had once remained silent. The plane began to roll. The cabin lights dimmed, as if the outside world was being turned down so the inner worlds of those aboard could be illuminated more clearly. Some passengers gripped the armrests as the plane taxied toward the runway, not because they feared flying, but because they feared facing themselves. The thoughts they had, but never spoke. The things they saw, but did not act on. The prejudices they never dared to admit lived quietly inside them. Ethan looked out the window. The sunlight grazed his cheek, tinting his face in the golden hue of someone who had not only survived injustice, but risen above it. He was not angry. He held no grudge. But he remembered. And that memory, sharp and seasoned, was what made him powerful without needing to raise his voice. As the plane accelerated, pressing bodies into seats, Linda touched her chest. Not from fear of flying, but from fear of the moment she knew was coming. The moment Ethan would say the final thing she did not want to hear, but knew he would. Captain Pierce's voice came through the speakers, slightly shaky, despite more than 2 decades of flying. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be taking off shortly. Please remain seated and ensure your devices are in airplane mode." Every word sounded like an apology, disguised as an announcement. He knew Ethan heard it. He knew the entire crew understood. And he knew the next few hours would be the longest of his career. When the plane lifted from the ground, the takeoff was smooth. But in that instant, the narration sensed something deeper. It was not just the aircraft that had taken flight. A person, a meaning, a voice was rising with it, higher and stronger than the roar of the engines. Ethan adjusted his wristwatch a small motion, yet Linda exhaled sharply, as if bracing for impact. She tightened her grip on the seat's armrest, an unconscious gesture as though she were holding on to her life. But her life was no longer in what she held. It was in the hands of the man sitting 1 row behind her. Ethan tapped his phone screen. The light illuminated Melissa's face. She shrank instinctively so sharply that she shivered. But Ethan opened only a single application, Legal and Compliance Chat. A cold wave rippled through the cabin. He typed a few lines, short, clear, emotionless, but heavy enough to make anyone who overheard shudder. Prepare full documentation, all footage, all testimonies. Begin protocol. He pressed send. A soft whoosh followed, and so it began. Linda placed a hand on her neck. Her nails trembled, brushing her skin until even she felt the chill. She no longer thought about her polished image. She thought about tomorrow's news, the viral video, the comments she had once mocked, but now feared like 1,000 needles pointing at her. Melissa stared at her shoes. Not because she wanted to avoid Ethan's gaze, but because she was trying not to break down. She thought of what her parents would say. Her friends. The dream she had chased for 6 years, becoming a lead flight attendant, now dissolving into smoke. All because of one moment of prejudice. Jacob swallowed hard. He thought of his crew, his record, his years of service. But more than anything, He thought of the moment he had looked at Ethan and remained silent. The moment he could have chosen what was right, but chose convenience instead. The narration touched Ethan's thoughts. He did not need them to fear him. He needed them to understand. And that was the difference between someone seeking revenge and someone built to lead. He tilted his head slightly and spoke just loud enough for 2 rows to hear. Ignorance is dangerous, but indifference is worse. The words swept through the cabin like a strong wind. Some passengers felt it strike their conscience. Some felt a sting in their chest. Some looked down at their hands, realizing they too had been silent when they should not have been. The plane leveled off. The seatbelt sign went dark. Yet no one moved. No one stood for water. No one reclined their seat. Everyone waited for Ethan, for what he would say next, for a verdict not from a courtroom, but from life itself, where even the smallest actions could change everything. Ethan placed his phone on the tray table, adjusted his posture, and then said, "We are going to fix this. Not by firing people, but by changing the culture that made this possible." Jacob froze. Melissa looked up through her tears. Linda was stunned. None of them expected that. Ethan continued, voice soft, but undeniably powerful. A broken system does not change by breaking more people. It changes when someone decides enough is enough. First class fell into silence, a beautiful silence, a grateful silence, a silence beginning to heal. Ethan Brooks, the man who had been treated as someone sitting in the wrong seat, had just redefined what real power was, and the plane kept flying forward as if the sky itself were opening a path for a change no one in first class could have imagined minutes earlier. The aircraft had reached cruising altitude, cutting through the white cloud layer like a polished blade. But inside first class there was no softness of clouds, only tension sharp as steel, and a silence so heavy it felt capable of cracking the window glass. A few passengers finally began to breathe again, though their breaths still trembled. It was as if each of them was waiting for a verdict suspended in the air, ready to drop with one small movement from Ethan. But he did not rush. His lack of urgency only made everyone else more uneasy. Ethan sat still, back, straight eyes fixed on the sky outside. Beyond the window the sky stretched open and endless. Within him there was a calm so beautiful it bordered on cold. He knew exactly what was happening on the ground at that moment. The Orion Air headquarters in Chicago was undoubtedly exploding with internal messages. Public relations directors were racing the clock. Assistants were searching for flights that could bring the chief executive officer back immediately. The legal department was curling in on itself like coils of steel before a storm. But Ethan was not looking down. He was looking forward. And in his eyes, the narration could see something first class, could not the exhaustion of a man who had carried far more days of burden than anyone knew, and who sensed that tomorrow would change everything. A small sound cut through the air, ting the message alert. Half the cabin felt their hearts jump. Ethan glanced at his phone. A notification from PR Emergency Protocol activated. Media requesting comment. Awaiting your directive. He locked the screen instantly, not allowing anyone to see his reaction. Because true power never lets the world see when it trembles. But the cabin had no time to settle before a small movement stirred in the front row. A woman perhaps in her 30s wearing a pale blue blouse hesitated, then raised her hand slightly. The first passenger brave enough to break the silence. "Excuse me, Mr. Brooks." Her voice shook, but her sincerity did not. I just wanted to say, I saw everything. And I should have said something earlier. A simple sentence. Yet it struck the cabin like a pebble triggering an avalanche. A man in row 3 lowered his headphones. She's right. I saw it too. I should have spoken up. Then an older woman, I'm sorry. I did not know what to do. A young man, I froze. And I hate that I froze. For the first time since takeoff, honest words were spoken. Not to beg forgiveness, but to admit their own weakness. People are not condemned for being wrong. People are condemned for staying silent when they see wrong. Ethan looked at each of them, not to scold, not to question, but his gaze alone made them judge themselves harder than any lecture could. Finally, Ethan said, "Thank you for saying it." His voice was gentle, and that gentleness made several people tear up, because it held no judgment. It held acceptance, and acceptance is the rarest form of kindness in spaces that are too used to judgment. Across the cabin, Linda Hartley sat frozen. She wanted to speak. She wanted to apologize. She wanted to insist she had not meant it that way. But the narration saw through her and understood she could not speak. Not from fear, but because she had discovered something she had never faced in her life. Her mistake did not begin with today's words. Her mistake was the habit of a lifetime. Melissa was different. She did not cry aloud, but tears fell quietly onto the crumpled tissue in her hand. She could not understand why the man before her, the man she had wronged, could remain so calm. He was not angry. He did not insult her. He did not destroy her career on the spot. And that more than any punishment hurt her the most. Jacob glanced at Ethan and then back down as if standing before the CEO in a performance review meeting. And the truth was, he was. But what was hardest for him was not Ethan's power. It was Ethan's character. The strong make us fearful. The good make us ashamed. Suddenly an announcement echoed through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are now at cruising altitude. You may move around the cabin if needed." The announcement was not made to encourage anyone to stand. It sounded like the aircraft itself exhaled after holding its breath. Ethan set his phone down, then turned to Jacob. "I need an update on crew training statistics and the last disciplinary reports." Jacob swallowed hard. I will get them immediately after landing." Good. One word. Yet it made Jacob stand taller, as if I were in the most important interview of his life. Ethan continued, "We're not going to hide this. We're going to fix this." His words fell across the cabin like a declaration that shifted the wind. No one in that cabin knew that in just a few hours Emily's live stream would surpass 1 million views. No one knew that 3 national news outlets would place the hashtag of the incident at the top of their pages. No one knew that several civil rights attorneys were already clearing their schedules to address the video. But the narration knew. It could feel the future turning page by page, like a book Ethan had silently decided he would rewrite. As the sunlight touched the aircraft window once more, first class no longer felt like a luxurious metal box. It felt like a courtroom, a classroom, a place where truth was being rewritten by a man once treated as someone who did not belong, but who had never been small. The aircraft continued forward, carving a thin arc across the deep blue sky. But inside first class, it no longer felt like a commercial flight. It felt like a space too still, too fragile, as if every word, every breath could trigger a chain reaction that would ripple farther than the plane's flight path. Below the clouds, no one in the cabin knew that the media had already plunged into a frantic race. A reporter at the Washington Post typed an email marked "Urgent Story Tip." CNN launched an emergency meeting. MSNBC dispatched a crew to the airport gate where this flight would land. Every outlet pointed to a single name, Ethan Brooks, and a single story, a chief executive officer removed from his seat on his own airline. But up here in first class, only 3 people fully understood the scale of the storm forming below Ethan, Jacob, and Captain Pierce. Jacob's eyes flicked nervously toward the information panel on the cabin wall, the dim light reflecting off the exhausted lines of his face. He understood that when those wheels touched the runway, his decades of service would not be judged by his experience, but by 4 words already echoing across the internet crew misconduct incident. Captain Pierce felt beads of sweat forming along his temple. No major in-flight issue had ever frightened him. But this one was different. This one involved the chief executive officer, directly. And he had authorized removing the chief executive officer from his own seat based solely on a flight attendant's word. He closed his eyes for a second. The hands that had steadied thousands of flights trembled like those of a nervous rookie. Meanwhile, Linda Hartley stared out the window, refusing to look at anyone. She was calculating, searching for some explanation she could offer for her behavior. But the more she searched, the more she understood one truth: there was no explanation that could save her. She had been wrong, simple, clear, indisputable. Melissa clutched her crumpled tissue. Each breath was a silent prayer. Please let him be less angry. Please let this not go too far. But she knew. It had already gone too far the moment she looked at Ethan and believed she knew who he was. And Ethan sat there, not angry, not cold, just thinking. The narration could see the waves rolling through his mind, memories of countless times he'd been underestimated, the moments people asked if he was in the wrong boardroom, the time security made him scan his badge twice, just to be sure the skeptical glances whenever he wore a hoodie instead of a suit. Yet Ethan also thought of the promise he had made to himself long ago. He would not destroy people. He would destroy the system that made people become this way. And today was the day the system would be exposed. A notification ping broke the silence. This time Ethan checked his phone. An internal email appeared. Board of Directors requests immediate status update. The board knew, meaning every action from this point forward would be recorded into the company's history. Ethan typed a short, sharp, precise response. I am safe. Incident under review. Will handle personally upon landing. When he pressed send, Melissa shuddered, not because she feared being fired, but because she realized he could have let the board handle it. But he chose to handle it himself, and that frightened her more, facing someone who refused to abandon responsibility. Ethan locked his screen, set the phone down, then suddenly turned his head and looked directly at Linda. The look was not harsh, but powerful enough to make Linda sit upright, her pulse pounding like someone shaking her from inside. He asked one question, quiet enough to chill her. Why did you say that to me? Linda opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Because she had no reason. Only habit. A habit fed by privilege. A habit fed by excess confidence. A habit fed by never being held accountable. She swallowed hard. I didn't mean you meant every word, Ethan said, cutting her off gently, not in anger, but as if closing a chapter that should never be reopened. Linda dropped her gaze. She understood she no longer had the right to deny it. Ethan turned to Melissa, who stood trembling like a half-melted candle. And you, he said. Why didn't you even look at my boarding pass? Melissa began to cry. Not sobbing, just silent tears sliding down her face. "I don't know," she whispered. "Yes, you do," Ethan replied. Melissa sank into the nearest seat, shoulders shaking. She could not say the word, but the narration saw it clearly etched across her mind: prejudice. It did not scream. It whispered. And because it whispered, it was more dangerous. Jacob stepped back slightly, as if accepting responsibility for all of them. "Sir, I should have checked the system. I should have asked questions." Ethan looked at him, his expression softening slightly. "You should have led your team," Ethan said. "Leadership isn't about agreeing. It's about preventing failure before it begins." Jacob bowed his head, like a man waking from years of blind confidence. The air in the cabin thickened again. It felt like everyone was walking across an icy bridge, and any word could crack the surface. But then Ethan did something none of them expected. He drew a deep breath, then spoke clearly. "Everyone in this cabin needs to understand something. This isn't about me being chief executive officer. This is about what happens every day when no one checks the truth." The heartbeat of the entire cabin slowed, as if each word sank into them. Ethan continued, "Power doesn't disappear when people ignore you. It simply waits for the right moment." Linda swallowed. Melissa covered her mouth to hide a small sob. Jacob stared down at his shoes, as if they had become evidence of his mistakes. Then Ethan said the final line, quiet yet unforgettable, "And that moment is now." Immediately a small sound echoed across the cabin, the soft bing of the aircraft entering descent preparation. No one on board knew that on the ground below, hundreds of thousands of people were waiting, that dozens of journalists stood ready, that the moment this plane touched down would become headlines across every platform. But the passengers in first class knew one thing: the landing ahead was not just for the aircraft, it was for the truth. The wheels struck the runway with a firm but smooth thunk, sending a vibration through the metal body of the aircraft like the heavy heartbeat shared by the entire cabin. But this was no ordinary landing. This was the end of a flight and the beginning of a storm. Ethan Brooks opened his eyes as the plane slowed. He did not look out the window. He looked straight ahead, as if he already knew exactly what waited at the end of the runway. The narration saw in his eyes no anger, no fury, but preparation. The preparation of a man not just facing a problem, but facing the world. In the row ahead, Linda Hartley pressed her hand against her mouth, tears slipping through her fingers. She had walked through hundreds of VIP lounges, been served, respected, admired as a symbol of success. But now she saw herself as an aging shadow exposed by the airport lights reflecting off the aircraft's body. Everything she once believed she deserved had collapsed into a deep fear of being seen for who she truly was. Melissa Grant clutched the soaked tissue in her hand. Her breaths came in fractured pieces, but her fear was not that Ethan could fire her. It was that his kindness hurt more than any punishment ever could. She wanted to apologize, but her throat locked every time she tried. She feared that an apology would never be enough. And she was right. It never would be. Yet she also understood, even if an apology is not enough, silence is the worst answer. Jacob Reynolds bowed his head, praying quietly. He knew that when the cabin door opened, it might be the last moment he wore that uniform. But he did not resent Ethan. He resented his own blindness, the way he let Melissa handle the situation wrong from the start, the moment he chose silence when he could have chosen better, And one thing he would never forget: Ethan did not shout. Ethan did not curse. Ethan did not use power to crush them. He used truth. Emily Turner nearly shook as she checked her phone screen. The live stream had passed 600,000 viewers. Comments surged like a flood. He is about to step off the plane. Pressure is real. This is history. And Emily understood. She was not just recording a video. She was capturing the moment a man, once dismissed, stepped into the light of an entire society. The cabin announcement chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Washington, D.C." But the pilot's voice trembled, stripped of its usual confidence. No one moved. Everyone waited for Ethan. The aircraft door opened. Bright terminal light poured into the cabin like a spotlight aimed at the protagonist of a grand stage. But Ethan did not rise immediately. He rotated his wrist, adjusted his hoodie, a simple gesture that contrasted sharply with the explosion waiting outside. Then he stood. Not rushed, not dramatic, just straightened the posture of a man who had stood before boards of directors and before life's courtroom, a courtroom he never asked for, but was always pulled into. First class held its breath. After several seconds of compressed silence, Ethan turned to the crew. He did not say, "I will get you fired." He did not say, "You will pay for this." He said what none of them expected to hear. "Learn from today. Not for me. For the next person sitting in this seat." His voice was gentle, but it entered each of them like a lesson they would carry for the rest of their lives. Linda burst into tears. Melissa covered her mouth, shoulders trembling. Jacob looked at Ethan with the eyes of a man forgiven, though he did not deserve it. Ethan turned back to the seat of truth, seat 2A, and placed his hand briefly on the headrest, a quiet farewell to a moment that would leave a permanent mark. Not to mourn it, to remember it. Then he walked toward the aircraft door. As Ethan stepped onto the jet bridge, he heard the murmuring of hundreds of people. But it was not murmurs of outrage, not hostile noise. It was the collective stir of people witnessing change embodied in a man they once underestimated. TV cameras flicked on with red lights. Reporters surged forward. Airport staff stepped aside, not out of fear, but out of respect. A woman touched Ethan's arm. "Sir, are you okay?" Ethan nodded. No extra words. None were needed. A reporter pushed forward a microphone. "Mr. Brooks, do you plan to fire the crew?" Ethan looked straight into the lens, his eyes clear and steady, holding no resentment. "We are not firing people today. We are fixing the system that made this possible." The sentence exploded across the internet like fireworks. Comments on Emily's live stream jumped by tens of thousands in seconds. Inside the aircraft, Linda buried her face in her hands. Melissa cried silently. Jacob removed his crew hat and placed it on the seat beside him, as if saying goodbye to his own career. But Ethan did not look back. He did not need to. He had already given the only ending they needed to hear. The narration saw the final image of this flight. Clearly a man in a grey hoodie, not wearing a suit, not surrounded by an entourage, not lifting a corporate symbol to show his power. He walked like an ordinary man. And that was exactly what made him extraordinary. Real power is not loud. It is quiet. It does not demand a seat. It creates one. As the aircraft door closed behind him, Ethan understood something today was not just an incident. It was a reminder, a beginning, a landing not only for a plane, but for an entire industry. And from seat 2A today, a cultural shift had begun from silence to voice, to real change. As the story comes to a close, one truth becomes unmistakably clear. Sometimes real power is not in the loudest voice, but in silence at the right moment. Ethan Brooks did more than expose the wrongdoing of a single incident. He revealed to the world how structural bias operates quietly in everyday life. From an expert perspective, this is a textbook example of default bias, the tendency to act on assumptions before verifying the truth. But what matters more is the way Ethan chose to respond, not with retaliation, but with reform, not with blame, but with the willingness to repair the system itself. If you believe that change begins in the moments we allow ourselves to see and acknowledge, hit like to help this story reach farther. Do not forget to subscribe to follow the next journeys toward justice. And leave a comment with the phrase, "Hold your dignity."